Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Hallie Tecco.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Krause. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
So buckle up and join us as we figure out how to improve healthcare for all.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Steve Krause, and today I am joined by one of the most successful healthcare entrepreneurs of our generation, Mike Pykos. Mike founded Oak Street Health in 2012. I actually got to meet him in the early days of the company, and so we can talk about that. He grew the company, which is one of the leaders in value-based care, very successfully over a number of years, ultimately taking it public in 2020, and then eventually selling the company to CVS Health in 2023 for close to $11 billion. So you can see why I say he's one of our great entrepreneurs of this generation in healthcare, and I can tell you he's also a great human being, great leader. So I'm super excited to have him on the podcast. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. It is great. I appreciate you asking me on.
All right, Mike, the guy was a lawyer and then he was a consultant and then became an entrepreneur. So Mike, talk to me about us. Like, that is a very non-traditional path to entrepreneurship. What was Mike Pykos at an early age thinking?
Well, look, Steve, looking back now, I could try to tie all those things together and make it sound like a really well thought out thread of here's how I was getting these different experiences that all added up to what I ended up doing. But the reality is at the time, I had no idea what I was doing. I was a biochem major in college and had planned on going to medical school. Went through the whole process, applied, took the MCATs, and then kind of got cold feet, right? And
did they let you in?
They let me in. Yeah, I think somewhere I probably still have an acceptance letter somewhere that I just kept, out of just to prove it. And again, you can't hold me accountable for my logic as a 21-year-old, but at the time that residency and med school was like half my life, and I kind of got cold feet. I was like, and was just wasn't sure I wanted to go to med school, and so was trying to figure out, well, what are my other options? And I didn't realize with a biochem degree you get like a normal job. Like that didn't.
You thought you just had to go like work in the lab.
Basically. So you can go to med school, you can work in labs. So I was debating about med school. I was bad at labs. I didn't have the patience for it. And so someone was like, well, you should think about law school because it doesn't matter what undergrad major you are. You can apply. Like, great. So I applied to law school, got to, spring of my senior in college, and I ended up going to law school in large part because it was shorter and had no residency. So I ended up at law school and figured out pretty quickly that I actually didn't really want to be a lawyer. So look, I love law school. You learn a ton in law school. You learn how to think. So I really enjoyed the learning aspect of it, but realized I didn't really want to do the job. And so ended up going to Boston Consulting Group after law school, in large part because they took people with non-traditional degrees, along with their MBAs. And I knew nothing about business. I had never opened up Excel in my life, but they were going to teach me about business, and I had enough student loans. They were going to pay me for it. I was like, this is great. So I'll go do this, and they'll pay me money, and I'll figure out what I want to do when I grow up sometime in the future. And end up really enjoying consulting.
Did you always do healthcare at BCG, or did you do like other types of cases?
First year I wandered a bit, but pretty quickly I found healthcare, I think, because I actually, I had the biochem degree. Yeah. I knew something about healthcare. So I kind of fell into the healthcare group. And you just got lucky, honestly, Steve. I did a ton of work with payers right around the time the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare was being debated and passed. And that was a lot of upheaval in the system. And so it was helping clients and just got really deep into on some of the challenges we have in the healthcare system. And that's kind of where the idea for Oak Street came from, was seeing that we had a huge need for better primary care, right? And at some point, something in my brain and Jeff Price, one of our co-founders, we just kind of clicked. And we said, wait a second here, like this will work. Like, why aren't people doing this? And we couldn't come up with a good answer why they weren't. So we just said we need to do it ourselves.
I always think that there's sort of like in a great company, and frankly in a great investment for venture capitalists, generally there's like a why now moment. And I'm curious, back then, you talked about Obamacare being legislated and debated and ideated. What was sort of the why now that led to the formation of Oak Street?
Well, it's great. So I feel like we're having a very parallel moment right now. So it is actually in some ways relevant because when the ACA passed, as again, you all know, they cut funding for Medicare Advantage in a huge way, right?
Yeah.
And I think people would argue, I think probably appropriately, Medicare Advantage is being way overfunded prior to the ACA to get more insurers to take part in it. And it was time they kind of clawed back that funding. So they went from 115% of Medicare funding to 100%, in some cases 95% of Medicare. And that completely changed how you had to be successful in Medicare Advantage as a payer. And it went from being put a network together, put a product out there, and it's pretty easy to make money, to, okay, we actually have to control costs. Okay, we have to actually drive higher quality. And it turns out one of the best ways to drive lower cost and higher quality is to work with more advanced primary care. And so then you have these groups like you mentioned in Florida and Southern California who were doing a phenomenal job of just that. But the knock on value-based care at the time was it can't scale. Right. Mm-hmm. And then you couldn't actually, and then it is,
sorry, Mike, when you mean scale beyond geography, or like actually literally like scale in terms of multiple tens, hundreds of sites?
More in geography, right?
Okay.
It's always this, okay, once it's all regional, right? And it works in Southern California because that's a very unique market. It works in South Florida. It's a very unique market. But when you try to bring it outside of those markets, you're going to struggle because all the primary care groups and all the provider infrastructure is organized so differently across geographies that it's just hard to scale because healthcare is a local challenge, right? That was always the kind of the belief in the marketplace. And so a lot of what made Oak Street successful, or the innovation in Oak Street, was saying, hey, instead of trying to partner with, buy, contract with the existing provider infrastructure and change their behavior, like we agree, that's very, very hard to do, and especially 12, 15 years ago when we were kind of working on Oak Street. Fee for service was so ingrained in so many of the groups in most of the country. We said, instead of trying to change them, let's just build it the right way, right? And let's figure out how do we pick one patient population, and we pick the population that had the most need, right? And let's build the practice from the ground up, how you build a practice, take better care of that population, regardless of how much things are reimbursed in fee-for-service medicine. Let's build it the right way, right? That's what we did. And if we did that, we felt, hey, look, what a diabetic patient needs and what a dual-eligible patient needs in the south side of Chicago isn't different than LA. It's just what's different is how kind of the infrastructure is set up today. So let's just build it the right way.
Yeah, totally. You've described yourself to me as being a risk-averse person, which is kind of hilarious given the fact that you built like a company that took hundreds of millions of dollars to actually get to success. But we'll come back to that later. But I'm sure with your law school mind, your smart mind, your BCG mind, you must have like analyzed this thing every which way to Sunday, like the risks. And there were clearly priors that investors and other people had, as you said, like priors that they thought like, well, this can only happen in Southern California and Florida. What was like the biggest prior sort of belief that kept you up at night, that you like sweated early on, that you wondered whether you actually were going to be able to solve in building Oak Street Health?
I think to that point of being a relatively risk-averse entrepreneur and then being, pretty scared of failure, I think it's all of them, right? I mean, I can't point to one thing like, oh my gosh, that was the thing we were obsessed about. I think one reason we were successful in what was, I think, a lot more complicated business than we realized when we first started it was we just were obsessed about everything, right? I mean, and I think that's what makes the business challenging. Number one, most importantly, do you have a better care model, right? Are you able to actually take better care of patients and lower medical costs? Because if you can't do that, right, if you can't lower hospitalizations, then what are you doing, right? You don't have a business in the first place. That's hard to do, though, right? It's easy to say, hey, let's invest in primary care and take better care of people, keep out of the hospital and save money. Much harder to actually do in practice. That was a huge obsession. Number two, I don't care how good your care model is, right? If you don't have any patients to take care of, then you're not going to actually be able to drive an impact. And if you can't drive an impact, you're not going to be able to make it financially viable. So we also had to be obsessed with how are we bringing in patients, right? How are we growing the practice? And at the same time, how are we retaining our current patients and creating a great experience? So kind of the growth and the patient experience become an obsession. And then you got to do it not just one time, right? We don't want to do one center. We don't have one geography. You got to scale it, right? So actually, I'm thinking back to those days, and we had like we call it the check mark slide. We had it in every board deck, right? Here are the things we need to prove, right? That works, right? And number one was the care model works. Number two, we can fill up centers. Number three, we can scale them, multiple geographies, right? And eventually become a national group, right? If we can do all those things, then we can create the impact we want to create and we can create the value we want to create. But all of those things are a set of challenges, right?
You have two co-founders, Jeff and Griffin, in this business. I'm curious, just because a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs, like how do you figure out the co-founder thing? Like, I mean, I guess you got lucky because you knew these folks, but any lessons to learn and how to sort through that? And it's the biggest decision, and yet it's not obvious how that works.
I mean, I think it's got to be a partnership, and it's got to have trust, and you have to really enjoy being around the person, right? I think those are the big ones I look for, because if you find someone who has all the right technical skills or all the right background or all the right the right resume, but you're not going to really enjoy being elbow to elbow with that person. You're not going to you don't trust that person, and it's not really clear how you work together, what the partnership looks like. It's going to fall apart. And it's going to fall apart because there's disagreements over how this pie is being split up or the direction of the company. It's going to fall apart because you're just not going to enjoy spending time together. You have to spend so much time with the people that that you launch a company with. And so again, one of the things that I've heard is pretty unique. I have an N of one experience, right, of starting a company. But what I've heard is pretty unique is how long we lasted at Oak Street, how long all three of us were at the business. And I think that is, again, one of the reasons why it was successful. And one thing that I give advice to a fair amount of people now who are thinking of starting companies, kind of probably similar to you. And one thing I always tell them is, guys, there's a pace that you need to be aligned on. Because Jeff, Griffin, and I, we all believe we could build something incredibly impactful, incredibly special, and we wanted to push and build that. And Jeff and I didn't have very many conversations.
Does that mean raw hours? Does that mean raw hours, Mike? What does that mean when you say pace?
I think it's raw hours. I think it's level of obsessiveness. I think it's level of focus. Yeah, it's all those things, right? And it's not a right answer, by the way. Like there's alternatives where you don't. And there's successful entrepreneurs and successful leaders who spend less hours, less mind share, less focus. But where you have an issue is where there's a different expectation amongst partners and founders, right? Because if someone wants to be all in all the time driving and someone's worried about their balance, which is nothing wrong with that. But if that's where you're at, then you're going to create that tension, right? Where if you both come in and have a kind of the right view of here's how we're going to go do things, then it works, right? Now, I think it's pretty hard to my experience, it's very hard to have balance in a startup at the same time. Probably others would tell you differently, but having that same perspective of, hey, here's how much time we're going to spend, and then the trust of your co-founder to be spending the time, to be caring as much as you do, that's huge.
Hey, what's your fondest memory of the early days?
Great question. I think there was a lot of wow moments in those very early days, right? Like the first day we saw patients. And by the way, our first visit took 4 hours to complete or something crazy like that. We
that's not scalable. That's not scalable.
Well, the good news is that, the day later we cut that down by 50%. So
there you
the
go.
pace of improvement was good. But just being like, wow, this is real. We had an idea and we got investors to trust us and we created something and we're taking care of patients, right? And then you start getting the feedback from the patients, and you have these patients who are in tears because the system has left them behind. They've never felt supported. They've always felt anxious. And now they have Oak Street Health and they feel like they have someone in their corners who's supporting them. And you just remove that anxiety from them. Those moments felt so amazing in the early days. Like, wow, we built this and we're making an impact on people's lives. And again, those were always the pinch me moments.
I love that because I always say I got asked once, what's the most important metric that I look for in a company? It's actually outcomes, right? In healthcare, because I say outcomes set you free. So just your answer, and you could have talked about a lot of things, your first sale, your first hire, but it was really about the patients, which I think is a great lesson for people to take.
Well, see, it's one of the things that made us successful, honestly, over the years, is we were always focused on the impact we make. And we were very lucky, and I think in fact, we chose this business for this reason, that we wanted a business where if we make the impact we want to make, we will be very successful financially. And if we don't make an impact, we will not be successful. And when we went public, we were very worried about it because I think most of our employees at that time thought we were not-for-profit. Because we never talked about revenue or profit or margin or financial measures. We always talked about, hey, how well are we taking care of our patients? How are we doing on quality? How are we doing on lowering admissions? How are we doing all these things that are important to keep our patients healthier? And how many patients are we doing it for? We talked about our impact equation, right? Our impact equation was how well are we taking care of every individual patient? And then how many patients are we taking care of? And you need both, right? Because you take great care of people, but don't have very many patients. You're not changing healthcare, right? You're not moving the needle. And you can have tens of millions of patients, but if you're not changing the way healthcare is delivered and really driving better outcomes, you're also not making an impact. And so we focused on that really exclusively, especially internal communications when we talked about with our teams, how we paid our teams, bonuses, kind of our culture we created, everything lined up there. And I think that really drove the right focus and the right success.
I'll never forget a moment when you and I were talking. I did look deeply at Oak Street and wanted to work with you. We won't go into why that didn't happen. This time it wasn't me just being an idiot and not seeing a great company. It was actually trying and getting boxed out. But whatever. We won't go into that story.
Steve, 10 years later, you're not bitter still.
Oh my God, am I ever bitter? And I was struggling because honestly, your finances were upside down at the early days. And I remember a moment where you said, Steve, hold on. Let's I'll go walk through every single lineup you want, but you got to pull up. Yes, we are creating a model that is going to be very costly at first and have a pretty deep J curve, but ultimately we're creating something that is value-based care in its delivery model, and initially is going to be fee for service in the revenue model, but we're going to prove out value-based care works because we're focused on outcomes, and ultimately we're going to get paid for that. And I'll just never forget you stopping me and pulling me up to be like, yeah, the model is not attractive early on, but trust me, if we deliver the outcomes, we're going to get paid for it. So that's the financial equivalent to your focus on outcomes.
Well, it's funny because the design decision we made early on was we're not going to try to be profitable or break even fee for service. We just realized, look, this is, and in the early days, we kind of looked at, hey, can we make this happen? We're like, no, there's just too many trade-offs. Like our care teams would be too small, our visits would be too short. Like this just isn't going to work in fee for service funding. And I think that's just a trap that a lot of people at that time period especially fell into, because they would try to, okay, we want to do value-based care, but we have to do it within the constraints of what you get paid in primary care fee for service. And you can't do it, right? And so for us, we just said, look, we know we're going to burn money like crazy. We know we're going to lose money. There is no path to profitability with a full center at this level of productivity in fee-for-service medicine. We don't care, because we lower hospitalizations, we're going to free up so much money that the savings we'll generate will make the centers profitable. When you were looking at it before, we were at risk because we didn't have enough patients, right?
Exactly.
We need to go through this period. Yeah, that was and again, those were things that sound so obvious in hindsight. But
you had a true north.
Right?
You were like, I don't care, you weenie finance guy. Like about, you kind of said it. It's not about what the model says today. It's like we're designing this chassis. We're designing this operating model to be unprofitable. Yes, that is right. You're correct, Steve. Good pointing that out. And ultimately, it's going to be profitable. So I'll just remember that focus on kind of the model line, the financial model aligned with the operating model. You were very clear about that. You didn't make any apologies for it, which I appreciated. So I referenced that you were on, and you talked actually about your business coach, and I need to get his name because he sounds like it was awesome. It sounds like yours had a really big impact on you. Talk to me, but a lot of entrepreneurs are reluctant to get a coach. Maybe it's because of time, and maybe it's because they don't see the value. But tell me about that, because I think that's a real lesson. I mean, you are one of the more successful folks in our industry, and you had a coach who sounds like it made a pretty big impact on your growth as a CEO and frankly on the company. Like I think one of the first meetings he told you this is going to be a $10 billion company at one point.
That is all very true. He said 100 billion. Actually, we sold out too early.
Well, you really miss Mike.
Well, I think he gave you until 2030. So the jury's still out if they can get the value. But well, look, it was actually a guy named Ron Charam. He was a business school professor at Harvard for a while, and then became a coach. I tend to be a person. I was a first-time CEO, and even if I was a second-time CEO, I want to gather as many opinions and as much input as possible for as many people, right? Especially people who've done it successfully. And what I find is, sometimes the feedback or advice people give you is not me, it doesn't resonate, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's great, but you get that portfolio of advice and you kind of figure out, how do I then apply this to me? And it really helps. And so I've had a number of business coaches, and actually I've always appreciated their perspectives. But one thing I kind of felt, they always try to change me, right? They're like, well, the platonic ideal in the business coach mind is an executive that does these things, right? And some of those things I did naturally, some of those things felt very painful to me. And this guy, Ram Tron, came in, he said, Mike, like, don't try to change yourself. Like, you've gotten here, your company is successful. This was probably 7 years into Oak Street. He's like, figure out what you do well and embrace that, and figure out how you mitigate your weaknesses. But like, don't try to change who you are, right? You're baked. You're further. And I really appreciate it. It was almost freeing. It's like, okay, good. I shouldn't be worried about, am I an empathetic listener enough, or am I doing this enough, or am I doing that enough, right? Just take what feels natural, makes me successful, be aware of the things I'm not necessarily as good at, and surround myself with people who can help complement me, but just be myself. And that was huge, right? And then also, his vision of saying, Mike, like, every time you meet with him, you feel very, like, I don't say the word inadequate. That's the word that comes to mind. It probably wasn't adequate, because he would come there and be like, okay, Mike, like, what are the drivers of your business? Take out a piece of paper and it's like, write them down. Okay, great. So why don't you do more of this? Like, oh. And you come up with like, oh, it's hard to hire. It's like, okay, well then why is it hard to hire? Like, he would just cut down to
it was so like first principles.
Yes, he was so good just removing the noise and be like, all these things that you worry about, that you're, have consternation, or like no, like, just like get through it, do this and make this happen, and focus on that.
Ram told you that you were already baked, which I love, and so be happy with that.
See, for the record, I told my wife that advice, and she said, like, that doesn't apply to marriage. So
yeah, I get that.
Yeah,
I get that. But as an entrepreneur, I ask this question a lot. What do you think your superpower is?
I don't think I have a superpower. What was interesting to me, Steve, was reading the goodbye notes. He was, obviously, as you know, and others know, I left Oak Street, 2 months ago, and left CVS, and a lot of people sent me notes, goodbyes, and I caught up with a lot of people. And the constant theme that came out, and again, I'm not sure how I should read this, Steve, but the constant theme is I push really hard. And I think people framed it in a positive. They said, Mike, you always set high targets for us. You aspire to those. You believe we could do those things. You believe things that in us that we didn't believe in ourselves. And wow, man, I left with a tough boss. But well,
it's interesting. It's tied in some ways to pace at the beginning, which you link to having symbiosis with your co-founder. So it's really interesting. Like, maybe you did realize that was like a superpower in some ways. Like, I get that. That's interesting.
Well, one thing, and this is where I love the mission of Oak Street, right? Because what we were doing was too important. And you just felt that, look, like, every time a patient goes to the hospital, that we could have prevented it, like, man, that's tough. And every time you get bad feedback, man, that's tough. You feel it, right? You emotionally feel it. And I really tried to kind of translate that down to my team, right? And then if you add those up, right, making sure that every patient who we can prevent going to the hospital and they don't need to go, right? If you do that, and you do that every center, every day, every team, like that will lead to great results. So how do we do that, right? And how do we not lower our standards? How do we not, say, well, we're scaling and it's hard to maintain? No, we should maintain performance scaling. We're going to invest in technology. We're going to invest in training. Well, we're scaling. How do we keep the quality? No, we're going to have better team members, right? Like I think just kind of continue to push on that and not let standards slip, and actually, frankly, keep raising standards. I think was something that there's anything I think drove through the organization. It was that.
You were one of the darlings of the first digital health IPO wave. I think that's safe to say. Not that it was always up and to the right. There was some choppiness there. I know 2020 to 2023 that you moved from being a private company, privately held leader to being a public company CEO. Any lessons learned that you could share there's going to be another crop coming up? Like the markets, I feel like they're getting better. I think they're going to open. There's I don't know exactly when, but at some point there'll be a new crop of digital health IPOs, healthcare IPOs. Any lessons learned?
Well, it was a really, I enjoyed being a public CEO, I think a lot more than most people do, right? Everyone said you're going to hate being public or it's really tough. And it is tough. I didn't mind being a public CEO. We were one of the first IPOs post-COVID, period. Well, the markets were great through 21, and that was exciting. And then obviously things changed in 22. And one of the things that we had to work on a lot with our team is just making sure, guys, this is not your performance, right? Interest rates are up, growth stocks are down. Like that's not because you're not doing a great job. That's not because our clinical results aren't well. And 2022 was actually a really strong year for us from a performance perspective. The center profitability was great. The clinical metrics around admissions per thousand, growth was great. Like everything's going fine in our model. And if we weren't a public company, we would have thought we were doing great. And that's what I always tell my team, guys, don't worry about the stock price. Like stock price will take care of itself if we hit our numbers. And if we hit our numbers, we take great care of our patients, we add patients. So nothing has changed just because we're public. And don't worry about the stock price because you're not selling anyways, right? So it doesn't really matter. So we had to kind of keep people focused on that. And that was culturally tough. But again, we really believed in the model and what we were doing, and knew that as long as, Oak Street in a bizarre way is a pretty easy company to value, right? You have centers. There's a J curve of the centers. You invest a certain amount of money up front, and then centers make a certain amount of money once they become mature.
Return on invested capital. Yep.
Exactly. And the IRR of Oak Street Center is like 45%. It's phenomenal, right? You put $8 million in, and the mature ones make $8 million a year. It's just it's a great business, right? And the challenge is how many times can you do that, and can you maintain the performance? And so that's what we looked at, right? And we would share. We were public, so this is all public information. You can see that actually the performance is getting better as our vintages matured, right? As we got later and later on, and the performance is very consistent across marketplaces. And so we felt great. And even if the market wasn't in a place that was really valuing growth stocks, we internally and we the board weren't worried about it. And eventually we just stayed. Interest rates stayed higher, and it turns out inflation wasn't transitory, and interest rates stayed higher for longer, and our price stayed lower for longer. And eventually, CVS came around with a price, and we just said, this is the right thing to do for shareholders. But we were never looking to sell, even during that period, right? It was much more around just keep executing our mission, keep doing what we do, and we will be very successful.
Yeah, I'm sure. This is your baby. You grew as a founder CEO incredibly. You just talked for the last 35 minutes about what a journey, right? From like your kitchen to one of the most successful IPOs, and then you're faced with the decision to sell your company and go work for the proverbial big company, right? And by the way, you stayed there for a while. I'm curious, what are the lessons learned about founders making that decision, and kind of what was your experience going from being the leader of a high growth company to now being part of a massive, massive enterprise?
Yeah, it was a big change. And when we were thinking about selling the company, there was a lot of debate in our board, right? Because I think we felt, while this stock price, where the price they're offering is higher than our current price we're trading at, we just felt that the price that we were trading at just had no bearing to the actual value we were creating, right? It's just more of a moment in time. The market's depressed, and we didn't need capital, right? And and we had been public long enough that all of our investors got liquidity, and we're already up multiples in their capital. So we really felt that we had a lot of strategic flexibility, and we debated a lot of do we want to keep waiting and just try to get to that that $100 billion price over time that we felt was possible in the long term, right? And really changing healthcare. And definitely was a debate, and went back and forth. We ended up deciding to sell because we felt that it was just the right thing for shareholders, given all the potential risks out there. And again, it just felt like, and we also felt, and I think in a big way that CVS could really accelerate our mission, right? I think we were worried at the time that, hey, do payers kind of all get their own preferred solutions and we're kind of the one without a seat in the musical chairs game, right? And I think it was a pretty valid concern. So yeah, when everyone's neutral with payers, we can be very successful, but we don't want to be the one left at the altar, right? Humana's got their solution, United's got Optum, and CVS wants to buy something, so they don't buy us, they'll buy someone. And so you get to a place where you're running out of options. That was a big determining factor of selling. We ended up selling. And one of our board members, Kim gave me some great advice. That might just so you know, right? Like, I'll support whatever you think we should do. I will support it. But I want you to know, if you sell, right, like, you are losing control, right? Like, I know you care a lot about Oak Street, and I agree with you that CVS can really drive faster growth with Oak Street. There's a lot of synergies and it can be wonderful, but you're going to lose control. And I thought that was really great advice, kind of going to that next phase where I'm not part of this massive organization. And when we joined, my boss at the time, Karen Lynch, who was the CEO of CVS at the time, she said, Mike, will you stand for a year? And I said, of course, right? I want to make sure it goes well. And, so it's never really formal. It's never a contract. You're just more of like, hey, I gave my word and, I wanted to do a great job. And I actually really enjoyed working for Karen because she, I think, had a lot of trust in me, gave me a lot of space to operate the business. And, we had obviously reported results and, they had to be in line with expectations, and they were, and results were well. And, so I really enjoyed that phase as well, because now you're seeing the scale at a massive organization, right? And CVS is number 6 in the Fortune 500. So the learning there and kind of seeing how much you can move the needle across the board and trying to figure out, okay, how do we leverage this to drive the healthcare delivery businesses? If there's one theme you're probably hearing here is I love learning, right? So I got to learn a lot. I got to learn about those businesses, learn a lot about a big company. But then I also kind of over the last 6 months or 5 months of my tenure at CVS also saw the opposite of that, which was what Kim warned me about, which is, okay, a lot of macro things happen in the healthcare, a lot of things happen at CVS, and suddenly now it's not just about our performance and our mission and what we're doing, right? You're part of this broader organization, which in good times can lift all boats, and in bad times can create other trade-offs. And so definitely saw that side of it as well.
I want to use our last couple minutes just to talk about some macro themes and get your, you've had a long run in a really interesting part of healthcare, and get yours, like VBC, value-based care. We're I don't know, decades into it. Maybe the last decade you'd say is where it was really supercharged. You had federal programs out of CMMI where you have folks like Brad Smith, who has operated in the VBC world, sort of saying that they've mostly failed. You have pockets of success, you guys, other providers like you, but where do you think we are? Like, are you proud of where we are in VBC?
I'm hopeful that if we talk again in 6 months or a year, I'll have a different answer to this question.
Why is that?
If you rewind back to 2021, 2022, those periods, right? I really felt like we were at an inflection point where we had gone from, okay, there's these promising models, and I'll put Oak Street in that category. There's others that you can share results, but aren't moving the needle, right? Because the challenge of VBC is not, can the right provider model drive down costs, increase satisfaction, increase quality? Like, there are plenty of examples of that happening. The challenge is there's still a very small fraction of people in Medicare, right, or in healthcare more generally, who are part of those models and who are part of that success. And so the question, at least in my mind, I don't know if you would agree with this, is not, is this possible? Is it possible at scale? Yeah. Is it possible to actually move the needle? So we have these huge problems in this country with cost and quality. Can value-based care be part of the solution to these problems? Or is it a nice little niche, right? And I really felt 3 years ago or so that we were actually answering that question about, yes, these things are scaling like crazy, right? And there were groups across the country that were scaling in a massive way. So it really felt like we were going to hit an inflection point. And if that inflection point is suddenly now value-based care would be more the norm, or really start to move the needle, and kind of the fee-for-service old way of doing things would start to kind of to shrink as a size. And and a couple things happened, right? I think some of the groups that were scaling massively, that capital was probably a little too cheap for some groups. And when the word SPAC became common lexicon, I think that was when SPAC became a verb as well. I think that was a challenge. I think some groups probably grew faster than they were ready to, and then they're kind of paying for that now. And I think number two, I think the government really shifted its stance, right? And I think I've talked to people who were at CMS over all these different periods, right, and across Democrat and Republicans, and that's not a partisan issue. But I think there was a few for a while of, hey, value-based care is part of the solution, right? And that was bipartisan. And we're going to make sure that we create the right regulatory environment, the right funding environments, and make sure that our decisions don't negatively impact value-based care if we want this to be successful. And I think something changed in the post-pandemic last couple of years where I think people still support value-based care, but I think they were more concerned with overpayment in Medicare Advantage. They were more concerned with how much insurance companies were making. They were more concerned with other issues, right? And made a lot of policy changes that, together with the overscaling, really just put a damper on the industry, right? So now you're in the flip space, right, where 3 years ago was a hot space, there was capital flow like crazy. Now there's not, and to me that's too bad, right? So I feel like where I would have said 3 years ago, we were at a tipping point. Now I feel like we're kind of retreating a bit, and the models that are getting funded, a lot of the ones that are kind of fee-for-service, kind of heavy models of VBC Light, there's nothing wrong with those, but like they're not really moving the needle in a big way for how care is delivered and kind of really changing the continuum. So, the Oak Street's out there still. A lot of the big payers, United owns models, Humana owns models, Elevance has bought some things. So there are certainly models that are doing it, but not nearly the scale and activity. And so the reason why I say hope is different is I hope that CMS sees that, hey, we squeezed a little too tight. And I've had some conversations with people who, are in that world, I think are kind of realizing that and saying, hey, like, we can't, yes, we want to save the government money. Yes, we want to knock out fraud and abuse. And look, there's a lot of people that call themselves VBC that were not doing anything that was value-based or care, right? They were just, they were doing it for the wrong reasons. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, we need to control the cost. Yes, we want to make sure that payers are really earning money the right way. But on the flip side, we have to make sure we change the delivery system. Otherwise, we're never going to get out of this trap we're in now of high cost and low quality. So that's why I hope it changes.
Well, it was fun to walk down memory lane with you, my friend.
Absolutely.
Congratulations on all your success, and thanks for coming on The Heart of Healthcare and sharing it.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe. The Heart of Healthcare is produced by Hallie Tecco and hosted by Michael Esquivel, Steve Krause, and Hallie Tecco. The show is engineered, edited, and mixed by Kyle Moore. Visit our website, heartofhealthcarepodcast.com, for show notes and details.